that interested in serial killers who weren't strangling their victims. He mostly paid attention to, like, the Boston Strangler, for example, or the Hillside Stranglers. He was much more interested in those, and he would collect news articles and books and whatnot on them and really study them. The Zodiac, was somebody who was more interested in shooting. I know he did stab some of his victims, but in general, the Zodiac's approach, at least in Northern California, was not what interested Rader. Now, I do know that the Zodiac tied up the victims that were in the park, and that should have piqued his attention. In my opinion, I think either he just doesn't remember, but he definitely read about the Zodiac, or he's just not telling the truth about that, which is not a surprise because there were other things he didn't tell the truth about. But some people have taken his silence on the subject to mean that he's the Zodiac killer. And there are people who've written articles, even a whole book on the fact that he's the Zodiac. But I say, if he's the Zodiac, first of all, how did he get back from overseas? Well, yes, he was in the Air Force, but he can't just hop on a plane and come back. Secondly, he didn't really have any association with that area of California, so it's very odd that he would just choose that area and keep going back to it and then go into San Francisco. Also, his fingerprint doesn't match the fingerprint in the cab. But in addition, one thing Rader really, really wants is to be famous. And why not say you're the Zodiac? That would absolutely make him internationally famous beyond all measure. And one of the people I know had a theory that he doesn't say he's a Zodiac because he's afraid for his soul. Like, I can tell you, absolutely not. That is not a fear of his by any means. So I don't see how, if he's a Zodiac, he wouldn't have come forward and said so, made claim to those.
You touched on something really interesting there. A lot of people think of him, they think of his involvement with the church. What is his religious affiliation at this point? You've heard of people like Berkowitz turn to Christianity. With B.T.K., it's really odd because he was already there and he's still committing the crimes.
Well, we have to really think about this concept that Rader calls cubing. And in psychology, we call it partitioning or compartmentalization, and this is a psychological development of people who are able to partition their lives in various ways and develop whole personas within each of those compartments. It's not multiple personality disorder, it's simply the ability to have a number of personalities going on at once who each have their own moral center or lack of moral center, their own set of behaviors, and they can be completely inconsistent with the other personas, but that doesn't matter to them. So Rader has a great concept that he calls cubing, and the way he explains it, I think, is probably better than what we do in psychology, and that is that he's a cube, and he'll operate on one face of the cube, even though the other faces of the cube that he can't see are there and they're part of him. And if he wants to switch into another face, it's just a matter of turning the cube to that face, and now he's lost the original face. But that doesn't matter to him. So his affiliation with the church, in his mind, is very real. He went regularly with his wife and kids. He participated and he became vice president of the congregation and then president of the congregation. He was very close with the minister and, prayed and took all of that seriously. But, on one face of the cube, which is to say his commitment emotionally was quite shallow, as we'd have to say similarly to, anyone in his life. Because if he could cut away from his family, his daughter and son, his wife, and commit these murders without any thought to what it might be like for them if he were caught, that suggests that when he says he really loves them, maybe it's not the same kind of love that ordinary people would have. So the cubing concept, I think, is really good because he's able to describe his experience of always having, one face of it that he's playing. So if you were ask him today, if he were in a particularly religious mood, if he just did his Bible study or something like that, or he wanted to impress you with his devotion, he would definitely talk about religion as if it were very real to him. But if you asked him on a day when he was in a different frame of mind, that would be just not something that he's going to be thinking about. And it seems weird because most of us we strive to live our lives consistently. We like to believe that we'll act the same across various domains and that we have integrity. For someone like Rader or Bundy or some of these others, integrity isn't a concept that matters to them. What matters to them is getting what they want, and if that means they have to create one persona for getting that and then another persona for being able to have other things that they want, like a family or involvement in their church and regard from their neighbors and the congregation, they're going to do whatever they need to do. And that matters more to them than being consistent in their behavior and beliefs.
And that's that compartmentalizing, and his word for it, cubing, was always interesting to me. Just because that seems like something that we kind of all do in our everyday life. If we're going to work and there's people we don't like, we find a way to deal with that. But these guys, specifically him in this case, I mean, they've taken it to a mastery level, haven't they?
Well, and I make that point. Dissociating is something everyone can do. If you daydream at all, you're dissociating. Dissociation doesn't necessarily have to do with, a mental illness like dissociative identity disorder. It's simply something we do. If you're in the flow of your workspace, you have an altered state of consciousness that is dissociating. So all of us can do it. Some of us do it better than others. A person like Dennis Rader really hones his ability to do it because he has to keep it secret if he wants to remain out of prison and continue to participate in his family life. He has to hone it. Early on in his life, when he was a kid, he was already cubing, but there was nothing at stake. But he already was doing that in his fantasy life and when he was developing autoerotic activities that he wanted to keep secret. So, and all of us have secrets, so we all absolutely know what that means. For someone like Dennis Rader and other serial killers, it is much more intense.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and it's one of these things where with Rader, I think part of it for him is that everybody has seen these confessions, where he's talking to the judge, and it's just so matter of fact for him, and that it explains the cubing in its own way there. But with you, did you how does he discuss the crimes? Is he straightforward with it, or is he continuing to kind of dance around it?
Well, I mean, when you see him on those videos of being in court in that sentencing hearing, the plea deal, he was caught off guard. First of all, he expected just to go in and enter his plea and leave. He did not expect to be taken through all the details. So you're not really seeing kind of how Rader is in those depictions. He didn't have time to prepare. He wasn't really sure what was happening, and so his whole presence is different. When he describes it, or his entire attitude toward his victims is that they belong to him. This is when he was committing these murders. This is life at its hottest. This is where he was most alive. And so he loves the details. Like he really works his way through every key full second of being in a person's house and what it was like and the good and the bad. The fact that his hands got tired, the fact that people who thought were dead, revived, or the fact that he tried stabbing someone, didn't like that way of killing, didn't do it again. The different gloves he tried on. He really loves working through those details, even though at the same time he will be saying things like, I really shouldn't be sticking my hands in the cookie jar. This is really not a good idea for me to indulge in this. When he drew for me for the book, his murder silo, which is very, very detailed, had to take days and days to get through all the details of this, the multi-storied silo with all the torture instruments that he included. He would say, I didn't really want to do this because it takes me back into that. But you can clearly see that, yes, he did want to do this, and he really enjoyed doing it, and he really spent a lot of time over the small details. So that's what I mean about the layers of his behavior. You want to watch not just what he's saying, you want to watch what he's doing, and especially the blind spots and the inherent contradictions.
Yeah, absolutely. And to go along with that, people both previous to your correspondence were more concerned about, are they trying to manipulate you, that type of thing. Is that something you've just developed an easy response for?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, but I remember when I was in Wichita and I was sort of giving a lecture, and there were some of the police officers were there who had worked on the case, and they said, one of them said, you didn't make him tell you the truth. I said, well, that was your job, not mine. I said, you had all these hours of interrogation, and I had access to that, so I could see what he said to you. How do you know he told you the truth? But my job wasn't to get him to tell me the truth. My job was to get him to talk so I could see all the layers. I wanted to see the deception. I wanted to see the manipulation. I wanted to see what would happen if I confronted him in a way he didn't expect. I wasn't there to get the truth. I didn't need to do that. I needed to get, it's a different kind of truth. It's not the verbal truth. It's the holistic truth about his life and his approach to his story. That's what I was there for. That's psychological. And that's something I didn't think that the officers appreciated, because that's not something they're trained to, first of all, to appreciate or to go after. And they frankly don't really care about all that. But in criminology and psychology, we do. And so I think I delivered to my colleagues a very full and multi-layered picture that would not really interest police officers. And so that was one thing. I'm not sure if I answered your question about that. I definitely knew Rader was going to be manipulative. That didn't bother me. And I could tell some of the times when he was. Perhaps I couldn't tell all the time. I don't think it's ever easy, because, first of all, you have to develop a sense of that person's baseline behaviors. That means spending time with them. That's exactly why I wrote The Mind of a Murderer, to show what these mental health experts did to initially learn as much as they could about the person before they started asking questions. You're looking for baseline behavior, and that means you have to have a pretty good sense of familiarity about the person, and that's a very time-consuming and sometimes expensive approach. But if you really want to get to that whole sense of the person, you have to spend the time to do it. There's no shortcuts.
You did answer my question, actually, and it led to the other thing, is that, these officers that you talk to, they're just not interested in the same level of, knowledge that you are. I mean, right. It's kind of, when you talk to them, they just want to, it's almost like you're talking to a computer where there's no logic to it. There's not the emotion, the feeling, where you're trying to understand all facets of the picture. They're just trying to get it done. I don't know how to explain it any other way, but yeah, I get
true.
what you're saying.
And I understood, and I watched their entire